So one day I was scrolling through my social media feeds, as one does, and I saw ideas being posted out there about how to reopen borders in Asia Pacific. There were a lot of rants, but there was also a lot of analytical thinking. And I thought, why don't I pose a challenge to these 4 individuals and ask them to solve the biggest pain point of all, which is how do we get out of here? And so to present the solution, please welcome, we have Lynn, co-founder of ZUZU Hospitality. We have Veitch, CEO and co-founder Wego. We have Johnny Thorsen, Vice President, Strategy and Partnership, Spotnana, and Timothy O'Neill-Dunn, Principal T2 Impact. So over to you, Dan, to wrap the session.
Everybody, thank you for being here with us. We are the 4 angry old men of the internet, and we're talking about how we move forwards. We're 18 months into this pandemic, and there has been very promising steps made in Europe and in the US about reopening the travel industry, and we're on the cusp of that here in Asia Pacific. So we put our heads together and tried to define a little bit of the why, the when, the what, the who, and the how for how we get out of here, how we go forwards for the next few months. So quickly on the why, nobody in this room should really need this piece, but obviously the global travel industry has taken a battering. In 2020, a 49% decline per the World Travel and the WTTC. That's a decline from a $9 trillion business to a $4.7 trillion business. Massive decline the industries have seen. Globally, we've gone from being 10.4% of world GDP to just 5% of world GDP, and we have lost 62 million jobs. And the effect here in Asia Pacific has been even greater, with a 54% decline. So we have to now turn from dealing with the health issue to dealing with how do we revive this fantastic industry.
Thanks, Dan. So if you take your mind back to Q1 last year, so January, February, March, we started to see countries getting shut down. The theme of the time was really about caution first. So countries were trying to reduce the spread. They're trying to protect their healthcare systems, give them time to scale up. We were giving our healthcare systems time to vaccinate populations. We were originally waiting for vaccines to be developed, then vaccines rolled out, and we were trying to stop new variants of concern from spreading. And in order to do this, countries were putting in place blanket travel bans and quarantines for the little bit of travel that was going on. And I think collectively as a travel industry, we all thought that was perfectly reasonable. And in terms of industries affected the most, I think we're right up there, but perfectly reasonable, and I think we're all happy to do our bit at the time. Fast forward to today. If you look at estimates of cumulative infections worldwide, we're at roughly 38% of the global population, or about 3 billion, and this number is way more than the cumulative cases. This is the number you get to if you work backwards from excess death models and what we know about mortality rates. So about 3 billion people. And then there's a similar number now that have been fully vaccinated. So roughly 35% fully vaccinated, something like 46, 47, at least one shot. So we're in a vastly different situation now than we were when we closed the borders and shut down travel. And in APAC specifically, the leaders amongst the pack, Singapore, Malaysia, China right up there, and Japan after a slow start, not too far behind. There's a bunch of countries in a similar sort of situation, and it's not too different from where most of Western Europe finds themselves. So today we're basically transitioning to the point where we're living with COVID, and the reality is COVID is circulating in every community worldwide now, perhaps with the possible exception of China. And every country has moved away from a COVID elimination strategy to a strategy where we start treating COVID a bit like big flu, as James referred to it earlier. So we're learning to live with it, and the the travel bans that we put in place 20 months ago are now completely inappropriate, and I would make the case that as an industry, we should be clamoring for them to be lifted now. They're not making a significant difference in the amount of cases, the amount of COVID that's circulating in any community at this point, but they are continuing to extract the massive damage that Dan walked through earlier. So now is the time for them to go. So travel bans, quarantines, they're not making any difference anymore. They need to go. And in terms of when a particular country should take that step, we'd like to posit that as soon as 80% of the 60-plus-year-old population is fully vaccinated, or has been achieved natural immunity through being infected, that's the time that the ban should go.
And that means actually 3 of us have to be vaccinated and or infected, one of the 3.
Hey,
back to you, Dan.
Sorry.
True.
So the what, in terms of sort of getting into specifics of what we would recommend. The first piece, we would strongly urge people to think about cases and not to think about countries. The models that have been tried in a couple of countries, the UK tried a green, orange, orange turning green, green turning red case model of treating different countries in different ways. Singapore has tried its category 1, category 2, category 3. We would argue these are not the right way forward. You should be treating people as people, not people as countries. All of these models are incredibly confusing. They make it very difficult to plan future travel. They make it very difficult for the travel industry to understand how reopenings are going to be happening. So we would strongly urge, once you've reached that threshold that Ross laid out, that we should no longer think about these different categories of countries. No country-level bans, a possible handbrake or exception for rare new variants of concern. So if a new variant of concern does pop up in a particular country, okay, maybe be cautious and put in a different set of policies for that country. So I think the UK now has maybe 7 countries which it treats differently, but broadly every country should be treated the same. Then the next level of kind of what we would recommend, we sort of thought about, well, what's the impact on constraining travel? There are some things you can do that have a very low impact, some things that have a very high impact. And at the same time, there are some things that are very positive in terms of helping from a public health perspective. And there are some things that we really question whether it does anything anymore or it's just the theater. So, for example, travel quarantines, we would put right down in the worst possible things we can be doing. They have an incredibly negative impact on the travel industry, and we're really not sure that they do anything in terms of protecting public health. As Ross talked about, COVID is generally endemic. There is no value in travel quarantines anymore. Singapore yesterday had 1 case that was imported, 2,554 cases that were local. 0.04% of the cases in Singapore were local, and yet we've shot 1,000 people up a day in quarantine because of that 1 case that we found. So the first thing we would do is say there should be no more quarantine. At the same time, we also strongly believe that in-trip testing, forcing people to get tested on day 2, day 4, day 7, day 14, most countries have already dropped this, but it's incredibly disruptive to your travel patterns, particularly when you've already gone through testing as part of the actual trip itself. So those 2 things we'd argue should go very quickly in all countries. The next set of things, the departure arrival testing or the dedicated flights and accommodation. So in terms of departure and arrival testing, Timothy will talk a little bit more about this in his section of the how, but we think that a sensible thing to do is for countries to continue to use testing as needed upon arrival. That can generally be done at the airport. It could probably be done with simple ART tests that give you a very fast result and a pretty accurate result. We think that's entirely sensible for countries, whilst they want to continue to be conservative, to continue to have some element of that in place. But the dedicated flights and the dedicated accommodation, and this is obviously particularly pertinent here in Singapore with the VTLs, we strongly think those are the wrong way forward. They're at best a fig leaf of pretending that the travel industry has been restarted. Go and do a search right now for any itinerary between, say, Singapore and London. I did a random one last night between Singapore and London on the 5th of January, but this applies almost any day. You'll see that the cheapest flight is a 2-stop through Lynn and Istanbul for $565. If you take that flight, you'll be subject to a 7-day home quarantine. If you look at what's fast but affordable, you find a one-stop through Doha for $700. So if time is important to you, you'd pay a little bit more for that. But then you'd be subject to a 14-day quarantine because you've gone through Qatar, which is a category whatever, whereas Turkey is a category somewhat better. So we're already kind of driving extra costs, making travel more expensive by the way we force these different categories in. But the real problem is the vaccinated travel lanes. By falsely reducing supply, you find that there is a direct flight between London and Singapore on Singapore Airlines for $859. But those are the 2 flights that Singapore flies every day that are not classified as VTL. You want the VTL flight so that you don't have to do the 7-day quarantine? That's $1,000 more. So with VTLs, we are falsely turning travel into the luxury item for the rich, not the mass market product that everybody should be able to enjoy. And I would argue there is no sensible health reason why taking that direct flight, SQ319, is more or less safe than taking the VTL 317. It's purely a fig leaf to pretend that we've reopened the travel industry. We very quickly need to move away from this. Exactly the same problem in Thailand with the SHA Plus hotels, with the Phuket Sandbox. It's governments falsely directing travel to particular bits of the travel industry, not letting the market work out how to bring travel back cost effectively. So we would argue no specific flights and accommodation. Where that leaves us is obviously local social distancing, mask mandates. The most impactful things in terms of preserving public health are left alone. The industry is entirely comfortable with those. Those are very sensible things to carry on doing. But those other things need to change sooner rather than later.
So obviously, if we look at those findings and recommendations, what would this mean, and who are the people that can travel and cannot travel? So you can categorize them in 2 boxes: the vaccinated and the unvaccinated groups. And that might sound harsh, but it is the best way for the travel industry to get momentum and get volumes moving again relatively frictionless. So when you look at the logic behind it, it makes good sense for any place you want to go that they say, we only want people who have been fully vaccinated to show up here. And obviously, that does mean you reduce the risk of constraint on the health network locally. You also make sure that people can come and go again relatively safe. At the same time, international travel in particular should be fully restricted. Domestic, each country can make its own decision. That's a local political decision, basically. And it is interesting when you think about vaccination. Why should Timothy and I be treated differently with our vaccination than somebody who lives locally in Singapore and have had the same vaccination? There's no medical evidence at all that we are a high risk to anyone, but that's how we are being treated right now. So what classifies as a vaccination that qualifies you to travel? It should be any vaccine approved by WHO, or if your home country classify you as being vaccinated. And that's an important one. We have to accept that there are countries who might have gone with a vaccine which they consider relevant, and if it's okay in that country on a global basis, we should actually be able to accept that traveler can show up because they are vaccinated in their home countries. If not, we will run into the next wave of challenges, which is that countries will say, I only accept 2 vaccines, anyone else cannot show up. How do we communicate that? We're back to misinformation and very easy misunderstanding in the traveler booking environment. At the same time, each country has its own national registry of vaccinated people, or most countries. Countries should accept the QR codes that are generated from those natural systems and allow you to use that rather than keep downloading local apps for tracing in a country. A QR code is the most recognizable element worldwide on a mobile phone. Why can't we accept it? We should also accept that minors, which in the travel industry, generally speaking, means anyone under 12, can travel even if they're not vaccinated. That's a travel industry definition, and there's no reason why it cannot apply here. And then finally, citizens and residents and visitors should have the same rights and the same status if they have the qualification of being vaccinated. There's no reason to have these different categories that are very hard to explain and lead to endless questions. And if you think about it, if you have this framework, you can certainly create a global consistent communication for a traveler to look at when they want to go from A to B. And in each of these cells, you know, in a from to country combination, I came from Denmark. I flew out Saturday, arrived Sunday. I was vaccinated in Denmark. I'm considered vaccinated here. I can look in the box and I can see what are the actual rules. So it becomes very easy for the industry to communicate. Because so far this year, I've flown on 5 different airlines. Every single one has a different way of communicating everything. And on the sideline, none of them can tell me what they're doing with the data I'm giving them. GDPR has disappeared in the process of COVID. That's an interesting side effect that has nothing to do with medical, but it's big on the data side.
Right, well, I get the fun job. How? If you ever want to look at a classic case of how not to do something, globally, how we've handled COVID is the exact example. Just think that after 9/11, 39 days after that, there was a global standard for how to deal with security. Here we are now more than 600 days after the first outbreak of COVID, and where are we? Inconsistency, mess, complete confusion, lack of trust, all of which is destroying travel. So let's talk about how. The how is, you've got to bear in mind that there is actually, surprisingly enough, for the last 56 years, there has been a system that accepts how to deal with vaccines. Everybody kind of forgot that. So we need to look at the how, saying existing systems and how the marketplace can respond. So the first thing is, oh heck, a simple proof of vaccination. I have 8 separate proofs of vaccinations in my phone. 8. I have visited 7 countries, and as they said, it's ridiculous, right? So why don't you just adopt the European one? It's already adopted in several countries, I think 24 in total now. And when I was using the Pass Sanitaire, I went through 6 countries, and it was fine. Testing on arrival. Actually, if I had a magic wand, I would make the plane safe. If the plane was safe, everything would be safe. But does anybody want to solve that problem? No. So the only thing we can be assured about is the sovereignty of the border. And if the sovereignty of the border is important, we must have tests on arrival. But it should be the first thing, as soon as we get trust, to go, because then we can start to build unilateral, multilateral situations rather than the very complex, very cumbersome bilateral situations that exist. The third thing is liability on the airlines. Anybody here from the airline? No? Well, if you don't know, if you transport somebody and the arriving country doesn't like you, the airline is fined $10,000 or equivalent on arrival. So if the airline transports somebody who is COVID positive, they should be fined $10,000. That will solve the whole issue of transporting COVID positive people. They need to be financed. And guess what? This is an existing system. It's in place today. Nobody has to do anything new. This is my favorite. Transparency of statistics. Does anybody know how many people actually tested positive on which flights, the one person that was talked about? No, nobody knows that. We're collecting massive amounts of data of everybody. What's happening to that data? It's going nowhere. When I checked in Los Angeles on Friday night, the poor lady who was checking me in, it took her 45 minutes and she had to interact with 4 different systems. The transparency of statistics is we should publish the data. I'm going to say this and everybody can be angry at me. Name and shame the airlines who transport people who are COVID positive. So the final thing is cost of testing. The cost of testing, I have paid $199 US for a test because it was a same-day test. I've also paid nothing. So why don't we just blanket, put all the testing, the cost, into the cost of the ticket and be darn well done with it, just like every other tax. So if you want to be angry at me, be angry at every one of us. But we are desperate to make sure that we can solve the problem, and these 5 simple things, they exactly do that. Thank you. A little bit louder. Can we have some little bit more enthusiasm? Thank you.
All right, in conclusion, This is our one-slide manifesto. So the WiT no country level bans, rare exceptions for when new variants of concern pop up, but other than that, no country bans, no quarantining. You know, once a country hits that 80% threshold, they just don't make any difference at that point. No in-trip testing. Testing is needed upon arrival, and no specific flights accommodation. Let's just let the market take care of it. In terms of the WHO, we think, you know, this proposal should be for vaccinated visitors only. We need a common and broad definition of who's vaccinated, and we're proposing the World Health Organization. Exceptions for minors. We think citizens, residents, visitors should all be treated equally. You know, COVID doesn't differentiate, so I don't see why policy should. And everything needs to be consistently communicated in terms of the how. Simple proof of vaccination. Let's follow the standards that are already most widely adopted. Testing upon arrival, liability on the airlines, transparency around the statistics, and including the cost of tickets in the ticket price. And
that's it.
Let's get flying.
Let's get on with it.